October 22, 1907. 10 a.m. On Wall Street, a line of people stretched for 2 blocks outside the Knickerbocker Trust Company. They were not investors. They were ordinary people. Clerks. Housewives. Small business owners. They had come to withdraw their life savings. By noon, the bank was out of cash. The doors slammed shut. Thousands of depositors were left penniless. They had trusted their money to the second largest trust company in New York, and it was gone. Just like that. But this wasn't just a bank failure. This was a contagion. A financial plague that would spread from New York to Chicago to San Francisco. Within 48 hours, dozens of banks would fail. The stock market would crash. And the entire American economy, the most powerful in the world, would teeter on the edge of total collapse. The United States had no central bank. There was no Federal Reserve. No lender of last resort. No one to print money to stop the panic. It was every man for himself. And at the center of this catastrophe stood one man, J.P. Morgan, the most powerful banker in the world, who would have to lock the nation's top financiers in his private library and refuse to let them leave until they saved America. But how did we get here? How did a failed scheme to corner the copper market trigger the worst financial disaster in American history? How did 2 reckless gamblers nearly destroy the entire economy? This is the true story of the Panic of 1907, the heist that gave birth to the Federal Reserve. Let's meet our protagonists, or perhaps our antagonists. This is Augustus Heinze, a self-made copper baron from Montana. In the early 1900s, copper was like oil is today. It was the metal that powered the modern world: electrical wiring, telephone lines, industrial machinery. Heinze had made a fortune in the copper mines of Butte, Montana. But he wasn't satisfied. He wanted more. He wanted to control the entire copper market. And he had a partner in crime, Charles W. Morse. Morse was a New York financier who had made his fortune in ice. Yes, ice. He controlled the ice supply for most of New York City. He was ruthless, cunning, and connected. Together, Heinze and Morse concocted a plan to corner the market for United Copper stock. They wanted to buy up all the shares, drive the price sky high, and force short sellers to buy from them at outrageous prices. It was a classic short squeeze. The plan was simple: borrow massive amounts of money from New York banks. Use that money to buy every single share of United Copper available. Squeeze the short sellers. And walk away with millions in profit. It was a high-stakes gamble. And it required massive leverage. Heinze and Morse controlled several banks and trust companies. They used these banks to lend themselves money that belonged to ordinary depositors. But there was a problem. A big problem. The short sellers were not amateurs. They were the big players on Wall Street. They had deep pockets. And they smelled a trap. They refused to panic. They refused to buy. Instead, they waited. And they had an inside man. The short sellers knew that Heinze and Morse were overextended. They knew that if they could hold out just a little longer, Heinze and Morse would run out of cash. Their scheme would fail. And when it failed, it would trigger a chain reaction of bankruptcies across New York. On October 14, 1907, the price of United Copper stock collapsed. Heinze and Morse had been outsmarted. They had borrowed millions they couldn't repay. The banks they controlled, including the Mercantile National Bank and the Knickerbocker Trust, were suddenly insolvent. The news spread like wildfire. If these banks were bankrupt, then everyone's money was gone. October 22nd. The Knickerbocker Trust Company, the second largest trust in New York, was hit by a massive run. Depositors lined up before dawn. They pushed, shoved, and begged to get their money out. By 11 a.m., the bank had paid out $8 million in a few hours, a fortune at the time. Then nothing. The vaults were empty. The doors slammed shut. The panic spread like wildfire. Within 24 hours, banks and trust companies across New York City were experiencing runs. Depositors were demanding their money everywhere. The stock market crashed. The New York Stock Exchange was almost forced to close. Businesses couldn't pay their workers. Workers couldn't buy food. The entire American economy was at a standstill. And here's the terrifying truth: the United States had no mechanism to stop this. Unlike England and France, which had central banks that could print money to stop panics, America had nothing. No safety net. No lender of last resort. If the banks collapsed, the economy would collapse. The entire nation would descend into chaos. As the days passed, the situation became desperate. The Treasury Department had only $25 million in gold to support the entire country, an impossibly small sum. All eyes turned to one man, J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan was 70 years old in 1907. He was the most powerful banker in the world. He had personally saved the U.S. Treasury during the Panic of 1893. He knew what was at stake. He understood that if he didn't act, the American financial system would be destroyed. Morgan took charge. He assembled the top financiers of New York in his private library at 36th and Madison Avenue. The atmosphere in that library was tense. These men were rivals. They hated each other. But Morgan laid down the law. He told them, "This is the time for saving, not for arguing. We have 48 hours to raise $25 million, or the entire country goes bankrupt." Morgan forced the bankers to pool their resources. He forced them to lend money to the failing banks. He threatened them. He bullied them. He even locked the doors of the library and refused to let them leave until they agreed to his terms. It was an extraordinary act of private power. One man, acting without any legal authority, forcing the wealthiest men in America to save the country. By November 4th, the panic was over. The system had survived. But it was a close call, too close. The public was terrified. Politicians were furious. How could a single private citizen wield so much power? How could the entire economy depend on one old man? The Panic of 1907 exposed a fatal flaw in the American financial system. The country needed a central bank. It needed a lender of last resort. 6 years later, after years of political battles, Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act. On December 23, 1913, President Woodrow Wilson signed it into law. The Federal Reserve was born. Today, the Federal Reserve controls the money supply of the United States. It is the most powerful financial institution in the world. It is supposed to prevent exactly the kind of panic that happened in 1907. But remember how it started. It started with a reckless scheme. A failed heist. 2 gamblers trying to corner the copper market. Their failure nearly destroyed America. The Panic of 1907 gave us the Federal Reserve. But it also showed us something terrifying. The system can be broken by the greed of just a few men. And sometimes, the only thing standing between us and total collapse is one person willing to take charge. Heinze and Morse? They were indicted for fraud. But they were never convicted. They walked free. And that is perhaps the most frightening lesson of all. The heist that created the Federal Reserve was never truly punished. The men who almost destroyed America got away with it. But the system they broke was rebuilt. And that system was built to last.